Hi.
Cool, we've gone live.
So my name is Tiffany and this is Monique.
Hello.
We are both youth project workers at Blam UK. Monique, do you want to say what we do?
Yeah, so we bring lots of after-school workshops into your schools to talk about Black learning, achievement and mental health, not only in schools but in the wider community as well. We've also just started a Blam Youth social media page. That'd be great if you could start to follow, and there'll be specific information there targeted for you guys.
Yeah, so today our webinar is on the topic of knowing your international human rights. So what we'll do, we'll both be splitting the talk today. So we'll be looking through what international rights actually are, who made them, why they're important to you specifically as a young person, how they're protected in the UK. So we're going to start internationally and work our way smaller into the UK. And throughout that, we're going to give you some examples so it's a bit easier for you to understand what is actually being said. So the first thing we should do is probably explain what international human rights are. So if we break it down a little bit, if we look at human rights, those are just the rights and freedoms that belong to every person. So these are things that are not privileged. Everyone has them, no matter what their color or their ethnicity. It's just rights that every human being have. International is something that exists between different countries and nations. So we're going to look at the universal human rights. So that is how human rights are reflected across the world and how they're recognized. So that brings that all together. So why do we actually have international human rights? So you might have studied in school at some point or seen on the TV World War I and World War II. And basically what happened after World War II was that the countries came together and they decided that we can no longer let atrocities such as the Holocaust or just world wars in general happen anymore. And if we bring in this concept of human rights where everyone respects each other, then it will help protect individual rights and freedoms and stop that from happening again.
The United Nations. The United Nations, also known as UN, was created in 1945 with the aim of stopping future wars. At its founding, the UN had 51 member states, but now today it's made up of 193 nations. Within the United Nations, there's a General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, Trusteeship Council, International Court of Justice, and the Secretariat. There are 30 articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed in 1948. So who signed it? From this map, you can see all the green areas are the 48 countries who signed the declarations. Those in black are the countries who failed to turn up to vote. And those in grey were not part of the UN at the time of voting in 1948. Remember, I said there were only 51 member states, so only 51 countries could actually vote to sign the declaration. Many of the grey countries were still colonies and were not sovereign states themselves, which means they couldn't be part of the UN. This raised a really interesting question about who actually created the articles, because many colonizing countries, such as the United Kingdom, France, and America, created these articles for the whole world, raising concerns around Western bias. While none of the member states voted against the declaration, a few countries decided to not sign it and abstain. There are 8 countries, which are shaded in orange on the map, who decided to abstain. For example, South Africa was one of them. Their government decided to not sign the declaration, and this could be seen as an attempt to protect its system of apartheid, a system of institutional racial segregation that existed in South Africa from 1940 until the early 1990s, and clearly violated several articles in the Declaration.
So it's very interesting to see what Monique was saying, because if those countries that were colonized weren't there to see the signing, it kind of takes away from this meaning. So here we have the High Commissioner of the Human Rights, Zeid Hussein, who's stating that human rights are for everyone, no matter your color, no matter your race or your ethnicity group, no matter if you have a disability or not, whether you're a citizen of that state or a migrant, asylum seeker. And it also doesn't matter it doesn't matter your gender, what class you're in, so whether you're rich or poor, or your sexual orientation. So if we're looking at that, we're looking at universal human rights for every single person, and everyone has them just because they're human. So here we have an example of the articles that are on the Declaration. So on the left-hand side, you can see an image that's of actually Eleanor Roosevelt, so one of the pioneers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and she's actually holding the Declaration in her hand. So like Monique was saying, there are 30 altogether. Some examples of the rights are your right to life and to live in freedom and safety, your right to a free and public trial. So that's, say, for example, you have to go to court. You have the right to have representation there. You have the right to be heard and to listen to. And you also have, everyone has the right to education. So that is the right to having free education. So you have access to that at a year where you're deemed an adult. So in most nations, that would be 18. Some schools it's 16. So one of the key things to remember about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that it's a declaration and not a treaty. But what does that mean? A declaration is actually just something that is agreed between the nations to be followed. So even though, like Monique was saying, they signed the declaration, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's enforceable legally in those different states that signed the document. What happens is that new treaties come about, and treaties are signed by different nations, which allow things to become legally in effect. So here you will have on the screen, you'll see Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. And each one of those treaties will be linked to a different human right, which means that countries will then introduce laws which will protect their citizens and individuals under that act.
Committees that ensure these treaties are followed. We've got several committees that are listed on the screen. Some of them are about the elimination of discrimination against women, against a committee on migrant workers, so making sure migrant workers are protected. I'm just going to play a quick video to explain this a little bit further. Hopefully this works.
The most basic minimum human rights standards have been discussed and written down by countries. Countries have agreed to follow them, and these have become international law. Countries must ensure people can enjoy the human rights they have been promised. Under each of these laws is a committee of human rights experts that studies how well a country is living up to its human rights promises. Every few years, a country must tell a committee how well it's doing and where it is facing challenges. This is a periodic checkup to see that things are going in the right direction. It is an opportunity for a country to honestly reflect on its accomplishments and challenges. The Committee of Experts gathers information widely and studies the human rights situation of the country. The committee provides guidance to the country on the way forward. In some cases, people can complain to a committee if they believe their human rights have not been respected. Some committees can even visit countries to see for themselves.
So I think that's really an interesting thing about committees. They work impartially to check in on what countries are doing if they are upholding these international human rights. Sorry, I don't want to play that again.
So like it was said in the video, you can actually lodge a complaint to one of these committees if you feel like your rights haven't been followed, basically. So one of those committees is the Committees for the Rights of Children. And here we have an example of young people taking a stand and actually going to the United Nations to complain about climate change and how that is affecting their individual rights as children. So within that Convention for Rights of Children, you'll have things such as the freedom for expression. So that's the right to be heard and to be listened to. You have the right to relax and play. You have the right to be held safe from violence, and also things like rights to education, which I mentioned earlier on. So in this image, we have someone in the middle who you might recognize from seeing her on the news, but in the pink top, we have Greta Thunberg. She's 16. And then next to her, we have sitting Maria Adebenji, and she is a Nigerian 12-year-old who they've gone to this convention to explain how climate change and actually conflict around the world is affecting all the rights they have as children.
So who do the international human rights affect? They should apply to everyone, even if a country has not ratified the declaration. And when I say ratified, I mean they haven't formalized the agreement. But while everyone should have these rights, not all governments have turned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into laws which can be governed. So that's one of the problems that Tiffany's mentioned, is these are rights, but when you look at it from country to country, it's difficult for those countries to actually pass in those laws. So this is where the European Convention on Human Rights comes in. It was an international human rights treaty between the 47 states that are members of the Council of Europe, not to be confused with the European Union. This European Convention of Human Rights protects the human rights of people in countries that belong to the Council of Europe, including the UK, and took lots of the articles that were in the International Human Rights Declaration to turn into laws. If a UK citizen felt that their human rights had been challenged, they would have to take their complaints to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg in France. This process could be lengthy and expensive. The European Courts of Human Rights relate to the 1998 UK's Human Rights Act. The Human Rights Act was made into our domestic law, and this means that the courts in the UK can hear human rights cases and therefore increase everyone's access to justice in this country.
So we're just going to go through a few examples so you can see how real life people have been affected by human rights and how they went about getting change for that. So first we have Ahmed Osman. He was a 14-year-old student going to a school in Hackney, and he had an issue. His teacher was actually stalking him. So there was occasions where he had been followed home. His parents' car at one point had their tires sliced. And he had complained to the police. His parents had gone to the police, but they didn't really take any action at the time. So unfortunately, events cycled, and his teacher actually ended up shooting and killing his father. So what the Osman family did was they took the police to court in the UK for not protecting his family. So they weren't keeping him safe. They weren't offering any services that would be able to do that. But what the UK court said at the time was that the police actually owed them no duty of care, which just means that they felt that the police had no responsibility to look after Osman and his family regarding this case. But the Osman family weren't happy with that result. What they ended up doing was taking the police, and in these cases, you take the actual country. So they took the UK to the European Court, what Monique was explaining beforehand. And what the European Court found was that actually the UK had violated the Osmonds' right to a free trial. And what that meant was that the police actually had to turn up to court and explain why they weren't taking action, why they weren't keeping their family safe. So as a result of that, that affects UK law directly. So now what police have to do is, if you have an issue whereby you feel unsafe and you've told them, they now issue something called an Osmond warning, which is whereby they have to refer you to a service or give you the tools and able to protect yourself. We then have another example related to stop and search in the UK. So there were two individuals called Gillan and Quinton. They were actually on their way to a protest against the use of violent weapons, so things like guns in public settings. And on their way to that protest, they were stopped by two police officers. The police officers had no reason to stop them, but they decided that there had been links to terrorism and that they wanted to stop and search them. So Gillan and Quinton actually thought that this was this is unreasonable for them to be stopped. There was no reason. So they took the police to court, and they had a similar result to the Ahmed Osman case, in the fact that the UK said that they had reason to believe that they were experiencing terrorism activities. They were involved in terrorist activities. So what they did was they took it again to the European Court, and they found that actually it was unreasonable for the police to stop them. They had no reason to stop them. So now what the UK have done is introduce something called PACE. So we now have in place the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which came in 1984. And under that, they describe what reasonableness actually is. So you'll hear on TV when police stop individuals, that they have reasonable suspicion of expecting them being involved in a robbery or being involved in whatever criminal act it is. And the reasonable grounds just mean that the police now have to be objective. They can't stop you just because of your race or because of your age or because you have previous convictions, unless that is directly linked to the reason they have to stop you. For example, there might have been a description given of an individual who is black and wearing a blue Adidas hoodie with purple trainers. And if you meet that, then obviously there's reasonable suspicion. But that is how taking a case to the Human Rights Court has affected us directly.
Organisations who help people protect their human rights. So we've got a number of organisations here who work hard to support people when taking action against the state, but they don't always have to go to court. If there's been a violation of your human rights, you can, for example, I think Tiffany was going to say with Osman, that case. Sorry, I'll let you carry on, actually.
Yeah, so say, for example, it's your teacher who is violating your human rights, or it's you have a job and your boss is violating your human rights. The first steps is usually you would go directly to that individual and lodge your complaint and explain why it is that you feel like your human rights are not being fulfilled or heard or adhered to. So like Monique was saying, you don't always have to go to court, and that's what we want you to take away from. It's not something that is that has to go that far. There are cases where it does have to go that far so that you can get change, but as individuals, we are all responsible for our own human rights and the human rights of others. So you don't always have to go to court for that.
And here are finally just some key things to remember. All humans have equal rights and freedoms. They cannot be given or taken away. Your rights are yours. If you don't know your rights, it's much harder to protect yourself or defend others. So this is why we've put on this event today, so that we can kind of explain international human rights a bit more, and so for you to get an understanding of your rights. And finally, the Human Rights Act from 1998 protects our rights under UK law. Therefore, you can now challenge organisations and state bodies in this country rather than having to take them to the European courts or the international criminal courts.
Also, it's important to note that we haven't actually gone through all the human rights that were in there. So the Universal Declaration is 30 articles long. But what you can do, you can go on websites such as the United Nations website, and you'd be able to find what the declaration is. You'd be able to find out what your human rights are, and they'll have a list of the different ones and how that can affect you. Also, as young people, you can go on sites such as UNICEF. So UNICEF focus primarily on the rights of children and the rights of young people. So that is probably a better site to show you how the Convention of Rights of the Rights of the Child affects you directly. So that was UNICEF and the United Nations website.
Great. So if anybody has any questions, I'd like to thank you for listening. I hope it's been informative. I don't think we've got any questions yet. So,
no. So we'll stay on the stream for a few minutes. You can type your questions into the comments chat. If there was anything that you didn't quite understand or you want us to go back over, just let us know.
Yeah, just researching this and creating this really brought out quite a few questions for me as well. Made me want to, me and Tiffany were talking about it earlier. Wanting to research more.
Yeah, and it can be very confusing. So we've just given you like a short, brief introduction into international human rights. But if there's any questions that you want to ask and you're not too sure that you want to put them in the chat, you can there's an email just at the bottom here, hello@blamcharity.co.uk. If you note that down, you can send us an email and we'll answer any questions that you have.
This event has also been recorded, I just realised. And so this will be up on our social media channels and website soon. So you can watch it again, kind of go back for anything that might have come up that you'd like to go over.
Also, our Instagram page at Blam Charity, we also have a new Instagram, Blam UK_youth, which you'll be able to follow on there. And that would actually be quite good because we'll have the links to different events on there, little kind of history bites for you so that we can go through that as well.
Oh, I think we might be having a question come in.
Yeah.
Hello. So it's Ife from Blam, the founder of Blam speaking. I have one really interesting question that I wanted to present to our youth project workers. So the first one is, how are young people able to speak at like UN events? Is it that they have to kind of demonstrate outside? Like, how would they be able to possibly speak at an event?
I think there's different ways in which you can do that. I think if there's a specific reason, like for example with Greta and people like Malala, they are going directly to the committee to complain about a specific issue that's affecting them directly, and that's something that young people can do. But then there's also things like Model UN. So that's where they will recreate kind of what it's like going into a UN committee, and you're able to represent a different nation and the rights that are affecting them at the time, and you're able to recreate what it's like being on the committee. I think if you go on the United Nations website, there's actually a link towards the bottom of the page, and it has an example of Model UN and how you can sign up if you want to get involved in that.
I think you can also contact the UN through their websites, and it might not always end up being taken to like the UN floor and speaking at UN events, but in Greta Thunberg's case and the environmental activism that we've been seeing over the last few years from young people, it would have taken years for her to get to that point, and for that group to get to that point where they were addressing those particular countries of the UN directly. But you can definitely file complaints, and you can get in touch with the European courts and the UK courts if you have been in a position where you feel like your rights have been threatened. Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's any other questions coming in from anyone, but I was going to say this was really, really good talk, and I really, really enjoyed it. So well done for putting it together. I think it was very informative, very, very to the point. Yeah, so thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks to everyone who listened and watched.